Hello, everyone, and welcome to Writing for Roleplay, a tabletop RPG podcast. I'm Kevin.
And I'm Kayla.
And today's episode, the main theme for our podcast about writing for role-playing games is to know your game and to know your genre. Whatever medium, you need to know what genre or genres your work will be crossing into, especially in today's modern day. There is a lot of works of media that like to just take a bunch of different genres and then smash them together. Genres set expectations, it gives you a jumping off point for new ideas, and also if you're going to be writing for a game you're playing, you should know the game you're playing and what the expectations are, what the rules are, all that good stuff.
Yeah, I mean, we touched in our intro session 0 episode, we talked about how D&D we talked about how RPGs in general are a collaboration, and so much of that depends on the expectations that you are setting at the table. And we talked about, railroading and collaborative story building and all of that. And I think so much of that is just set into genre. And if you understand the genre of the game you are playing, and you lean into that, it's going to save you so much headache in terms of disagreements at the table or resentment, I guess. It feels like such a strong word, but that's really what it becomes, is resentment when everybody is playing a different game. And I think just adapting your play style and playing the character that suits the genre that you're in, whether it's a character that plays all of the tropes straight or subverts it, as long as it's a character that belongs in that genre, in that game, you're going to have a great time. And we'll talk a lot more about character creation in its own specific episode.
Mm-hmm.
This is just right now talking in general about genre and game and sort of finding what works best for you and your table and what you might be most interested in.
And, the reason we're also bringing up genre is because not every game is Dungeons & Dragons.
Yeah.
Not every tabletop RPG is a fantasy dungeon crawler. There are countless other tabletop RPGs out there that exist in genres outside of fantasy. You can play a sci-fi tabletop RPG. You can play a horror tabletop RPG. You can play a romance TTRPG. There's a bunch of different genres out there.
You can play a dating sim with all of your friends. The world is your oyster. I mean, some people, they play D&D like a dating sim with all of their friends, and that's valid. But if you wanted to do that without D&D's crutch, that's also, there's that. There's so many options out there, guys.
But even if you are playing Dungeons & Dragons, you should still know the fantasy genre, both its strengths and its flaws, its expectations, its trappings, because as you said, Kayla, we want everyone to sort of be playing the same game here with the same expectations.
Yeah.
And part of setting those expectations is having a session 0, and another big part of setting those expectations is understanding the genre of game that you're playing in.
And a note on genre, if you're writing your homebrew game or trying to choose a game to play or building a character, and maybe, I don't know, I watch and read and listen to so many different, I have a very broad base of knowledge, I would say, on my entertainment consumption. I'm not necessarily super deep into a lot of subjects. I'm very broad. I take a little bit from everywhere. I dip into everything. That's just kind of the way I go. It's a little eclectic. And some people, they might be very deep into one genre, or maybe some people are busy adults and they don't watch as many movies and TV shows or read as many books as I do, but they're interested in role playing, and maybe they're just not as familiar with genre conventions. Maybe you're 14 years old and you're still in like English 101 and you're just now learning critical analysis theory and all of that. I would say if you're unsure, sort of, when we say genre, if you're unsure about that, if you're unsure what tropes are, I would check out tvtropes.org, which I think is a great resource as a knowledge base and jumping off point. It categorizes pretty much every piece of media you could think of, and every trope that's ever been put to page, screen, tabletop, radio waves, or stone. It's an excellent way to familiarize yourself with the storytelling elements. And also even like the history of certain tropes and where they come from. It gives you examples of where you can find these things in different pieces of media. So for example, there's like a Curse of Strahd page, it has spoilers. So if you don't want spoilers, like don't go specifically to the Curse of Strahd page, but it has a Curse of Strahd page and it'll list out all of the tropes that you can find in Curse of Strahd and an explanation of what that is. And you can click on different tropes and understand what it is, see the subversions, all of that. And it just gives you it's like Spark Notes. Think of it as like a time-saving resource and like a good study book. It's never going to be as valuable as actually engaging with original source material. So absolutely, I recommend to read and watch and listen to as many pieces of media as you possibly can in which to build your creative well and your knowledge base. TV Tropes it's the Spark Notes of genre media.
I mean, what's that big advice? How do you learn how to write? You read.
You read, yeah. You have to read. You have to watch stuff. That's really at the end of the day. You do have to study.
So the main point of this episode is we're going to kind of like go through a couple of different genres and talk about sort of the trappings of those genres, but also talk about some games that are in those genres who can like emulate the expectations and the cliches and the tropes that you want to emulate in your own table. Because I feel like an angle that a lot of people take discovering new tabletop RPGs is the thought of like, man, I really like blank. Like I like Lord of the Rings or I like Star Wars. I would love to play Lord of the Rings or Star Wars or Game of Thrones at my table.
Yeah. And I think one of the pitfalls too, we've talked about different systems, is because D&D is so popular and it is a lot of people's introduction and the first one that they go to. I think sometimes they want to play a game that D&D is not the most suited for, and they try and put a square hole into a square peg into a round hole. And you can retrofit D&D into a lot of different game styles and genres. It's a very customizable game, I think. But if you're not so experienced in roleplay, then it's sometimes better, I think, just to choose an entirely different system that is suited for the game that you want to play. And also, like, just choosing the game that is the game that you want to actually play is a great idea, Not all of them are super complicated. Like, D&D has a lot of rules, so I think everybody assumes that every RPG has a really thick player's guide and DM's guide and all of these rules. Not all of them are like that. And honestly, if you are pretty familiar with D&D and those rules and that, it's not even that crunchy. Like, geez, Pathfinder's crunchy. But if you are familiar with all of that, then picking up another system is not going to be that difficult.
Yeah, I think there is a sort of gate within this industry that a lot of people don't allow themselves to pass, where they learn Dungeons & Dragons and then they try to retrofit Dungeons & Dragons into the different kinds of games that they want to play. Like, oh, I want to play a noir detective thriller. Let's use Dungeons & Dragons and file off the serial numbers. And it's like, no, you can also play another game. And a lot of these games out here aren't as difficult to learn as Dungeons & Dragons. You say yourself, like, Dungeons & Dragons isn't the crunchiest game out there.
No.
But, like, in terms of the spectrum of, like, rules light to crunch, Dungeons & Dragons is still, like, in the upper middle.
Oh, certainly. Like certainly. It is absolutely crunchier, on the crunchier side. But I played Pathfinder once. Talk about math nerds. I had to use a computer program just to understand what I was rolling to input everything for me, because it was just so much to keep track of. To the people that love Pathfinder, kudos to you. I
played a demo of Shadowrun at Gen Con one year, and I remember just doing like this. I think I was just shooting a guy, and I had to roll like 13 d6 at once.
Oh my god!
Yeah, exactly. Like Shadowrun is the kind of game where you just put as many d6s in your hand as possible and then roll them all at once. But we're getting sidetracked.
That's
here.
Certainly satisfying, but geez, just go work for NASA. It'll be easier. I bet, you know what? That's what the NASA nerds are doing in their free time, is they're playing Shadowrun with 13 d6.
I fully believe that everyone who works at NASA plays TTRPGs. Like,
absolutely.
TTRPGs is the hobby of people who like to do fast math.
Absolutely. That one bit in The Martian where they go to the secret meeting. What was it? Oh, geez. I've read Lord of the Rings and I'm forgetting what the secret meeting was called. And the communications director is like, what the heck is this? And they're all like, it's a Lord of the Rings reference. And she's like, what? the PR people at NASA, I do truly wonder if they are nerds or if they're like the normies, and then everybody else is a giant nerd. I wanted to work at NASA when I was a little kid. Call me, NASA. Call me.
NASA, email us at
Oh my god!
digitalkaijustudios@gmail.com.
Speaking of NASA and RPGs, NASA released an RPG. I want to.
We're recording this. We're recording this in April 2024. So for when this actually comes out, like I believe, like a few weeks to a few months ago, NASA released their own tabletop RPG, and we need to play it, Kayla.
Yeah, absolutely, we need to play it. Okay, well, let's talk about fantasy first.
Yeah, let's talk about the genres. Let's start with fantasy because that's the big one in the space.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're crediting Dungeons and Dragons as a lot of people's entry point into the hobby. So let's talk about the fantasy genre.
Yep.
First off, there are many different types of fantasy. Some people get into a fantasy game, and some people want to play high fantasy, like Lord of the Rings or Discworld, where it's like wizards with pointy hats and magic is everywhere. And then there are people who want to play low fantasy, so, you know, where like Game of Thrones, where it's like, yeah, this is fantasy. There's a medieval aesthetic, but like the magic is rarer. Like it's not common for wizards to be in towers and for magical rings and swords to be everywhere. If something is magical in a low fantasy setting, it's a much bigger deal.
Yes, it like there's dragons, but you know the dragons are very comparable to nukes in 1945.
Exactly.
Versus nukes today. We should get rid of some of those nukes, maybe. Anyway.
So there's a sliding spectrum of like high fantasy to low fantasy in the genre, and then there's even more subsects of fantasy. Like you have like dark fantasy, like you know your Dark Souls, for example, where it's fantasy and you have all the trappings of fantasy, but there's this like grim outlook to everything. Like, oh yeah, things were once grand and magical, but no more, and everything is ruins, and the dragons have cancer and all.
The dragons have cancer? Oh my god.
Like a third of the bosses in like Dark Souls games are like, we are afflicted with a terrible illness and we're gonna take it out on you.
Oh my gosh. The real enemy of Dark Souls is just cancer, apparently.
And then you have a bunch of other different subsects of fantasy. Like you have urban fantasy, like your Dresden Files and your Percy Jackson, where it's like, oh, we're in like the modern day. We're in New York City, but also there's elves.
Yeah.
By the way, Bright, the movie where they like try to do urban fantasy and then don't think about the world building at all, don't use that as a good example.
I don't know if anybody is using Bright as an example.
I need to call out Bright.
I forgot that movie existed.
As you should. I needed to call out the movie at least once on this podcast where Will Smith like hits a fairy with a broom and goes, "Fairy lives don't matter."
Yeah, that was what a film. Percy Jackson's a pretty good example of urban fantasy if we're going to go with something that is very wide-reaching. You know, it's got the... I would also argue in many ways, too, this is a hot take, John Wick is something of an urban fantasy. Technically, there's no actual magic, but in terms of the way that there is this whole complex, very like structured and populated world existing alongside the normal world where everybody deals in favors and there's all of these archaic rules and it's all a hierarchy that upon which a mysterious shadow organization rules. And, you know, that's pretty fairy tale, urban fantasy, fae vibes right there. So, you know, you could throw in some actual magic, and in many ways John Wick's ability to survive any of that is magical.
The magic of John Wick is the fact that he can jump out of like a 5-story building, land on a car, and be perfectly fine afterwards.
He's not perfectly fine, to be fair. He is hurting. They had to time skip in that fourth movie. I love John Wick. We'll do a bonus episode on John Wick at some point for something.
I'm sorry, I'm imagining the writing for roleplay bonus episode of John Wick, and like the entire episode is us trying desperately to connect John Wick to role-playing games. Just
I
like,
can
no,
do it.
No, you don't understand.
I could do it. I could build John Wick in D&D.
Let us know in the comments if you want us to do a bonus episode about John Wick and D&D.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the fantasy genre, even with like the fantasy genre that a lot of people think that they know what it's about, there's a bunch of different kinds of fantasy, a bunch of different perspectives on fantasy. So it pays to know what kind of fantasy you're getting into and what kind of fantasy the players at the table think they're getting into.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are still, of course, trappings of the broader fantasy genre. You can tell heroic stories of great trial. You can pull from all different kinds of mythologies. You can have elves and leprechauns and giants and werewolves and all of these different things. It's magic. You can do whatever you want. And speaking of doing whatever you want, you can also create amazing world building. Like even in the more grounded, like urban fantasy, like we're talking about, where it's like the setting is New York, it's still an entirely different world once you add the secret magical underworld to it. So you're not just exploring New York, you're exploring New York, but also like the leprechauns live in the sewers. And that's an entire different like society that you're having to figure out. I'm going all over the place here, but that's kind of the point, is that the fantasy genre can also go all over the place. So if you need to narrow down your expectations, then, figure out the fantasy game that you want to play that hits that like corner of fantasy that you want to hit, whether it's high fantasy, low fantasy, dark fantasy, urban fantasy, noir fantasy, whatever. And learning the game's rules will help you narrow down your expectations and the trappings of what kind of story you want to tell.
And it's good to know the type of fantasy you're playing too, because you don't want to go into, playing a wizard, wanting to play a wizard character or a mage character or a high caster character in a low fantasy setting can be a little bit difficult, because if you want access to spell books or to a lot of magical items or things like that, they may not be available. And so you might be playing a character that it feels like this character is maybe kind of nerfed by the genre that you're playing in. And so I do think that building, and again, we'll go into this more in depth, but you definitely want to build your character around the world that you're in. I think rather than coming in with, I definitely want to play this character, what game are we playing? And then trying to adapt it to that. Because if you're playing, a super high fantasy one where magic is everywhere, it's a high arcane society, playing a character that doesn't use any magic at all, that could end up being a little frustrating, perhaps. You could end up feeling stuck or feeling not quite as powerful. It's just one of those things where we are so shaped and defined by the world that we are in that you need to understand the world that you're going to play in, I think, before you start building character creation. And that way you are building a character that suits that world, and then you'll feel like an actual main character. So that's the other thing. Like, if everybody wants to play wizards, don't play a low fantasy game then, maybe you like Game of Thrones and you want to play Game of Thrones. Playing a bunch of wizards in Game of Thrones maybe is not going to be the most conducive to the game that you're playing.
Mm-hmm. And, a note about like knowing your genre is knowing the tropes and trends that have been like carried over throughout all the different stories in the genre, but kind of being aware of like, all right, do we still need this trope, or have we kind of like moved forward from the passive ideas that this trope kind of hits? So for example, the fantasy genre sometimes carries on the problematic trend of bioessentialism, where it's like, oh, here is an orc, and all of the orcs of the race orc are the same. They are aggressive, they are bloodthirsty, you should kill them on sight because they are not human. And, there's a type of game where you can have that, where it's like, oh, these are literal monsters, and we're not thinking about,
are they human?
Yeah, we're not thinking, yeah, these are goblins that we're fighting, and we're not thinking about whether they're human. But if you're also playing a game where it's like the orcs can read and write and talk and have culture and communication, you should also think about, like, okay, these are a people.
Yeah.
Is it okay that we're just mowing them down?
Like, are we fighting this band of orcs because this band of orcs happens to be thieves that tried to rob our camp, and that's not necessarily what all orcs do. This is just what this particular band of orcs is doing. Or are we fighting orcs because orcs are not humanoid, you know?
Yeah.
And that's, like, that's not to say that, you know, it's so complicated because the legacy of some of these tropes in fantasy, you know, they're hundreds of years old and they can be steeped in very problematic, outdated views. And we carry them on forward and we maybe don't think about it or whatever. And this is, like, you know, it's a game. It's a game and it's meant to be fun, you know? So it's not like you need to have a social political 202 class in every single game that you're playing, but it's just something to be aware of because we all have different backgrounds. You know, you're playing with all sorts of different people, and the last thing you want to do is accidentally be incredibly, you know, bigoted towards one of the players at the table because you weren't thinking about, you know, the way that you're presenting this trope of that this trope is, you know, supposed to, it comes from a representation of a marginalized group and you're carrying on something that might be like racist or anti-Semitic or misogynistic or something like that. You know, it's good to kind of examine this and think about it. And one of the positives is that we're starting to see some changes in the text of official RPGs on things like races and species, or races becoming species, and the acknowledgement that these are supposed to be humanoid characters. They are not supposed to be essentially animals, and we are going to change the language around that. Like, you know, and we're going to change this, like, bioessentialism from nature to nurture. You know, you can play an orc that you don't have to have, you know, constitution and strength bonuses or whatever. You don't have to play a barbarian orc. You can play an orc that is a wizard or whatever. And many players are already just automatically doing this. You know, they're like, I don't want to do that. I want to play it my own. I'm going to customize it, etc. But it's nice to see that the language, the official language, is starting to kind of catch up, because there is, in some of these games, very problematic things, because they're based off of, you know, for example, Curse of Strahd has some problematic elements in it because it's so heavily inspired by Dracula, which was written in the late 1880s, 1890s, something like that. And I've read Dracula. I love Dracula. Oh boy!
Yeah.
You know, Bram Stoker was a white guy from Ireland in, you know, the 1800s, and he had some pretty, like, Dracula's a pretty xenophobic, sexist, racist book in so many ways. Anti-Semitic too. It's a good book. You know, you can enjoy these problematic media, but it's also important to recognize the nasty bits in it.
Oh yeah.
And the ways in which it is carrying on things that don't fit. And if you don't critically analyze some of this, it's going to carry over into ways that you think about everyday life, you know? So I think it's, you know, you don't want to, it's just important to keep in mind the tropes as you're going through. And, you know, sci-fi's got some problematic stuff too, with the way that it might handle technology and ableism with enhancements and things like that. So it's just something to, like, keep in mind when you are reading a game book and you come across something. You know, do you want to keep this, or is this something that is outdated that we've accidentally hung on to, or unintentionally hung on to, or uncritically hung on to, I guess might be the way to put it. If that's something that the game, that you guys want to deal with in your game, if you want to go through and explore sexism, racism, homophobia, bigotry, xenophobia, etc., if that is something that everybody has agreed to go through, because maybe you want to work some stuff out, or it's interesting to you and you want to have that as a conflict in your story, that's fine. if you want to have a story that is like a utopian society where sexism isn't a thing, also great. Like, lovely. You can media and games, it's all about exploring life pretty much.
Yeah.
And wish fulfillment also, so it's just, you gotta keep an eye on it.
Yeah, and we're not saying like avoid all problematic media. Your consumption is your politics. Like,
Yeah.
you can play an all villain campaign and be like, I love mass murdering, or you can watch Lord of the Rings and be anti-monarchist, but
Yes.
also like story of Aragorn lifting the sword and becoming the one true king.
We are all suckers for Aragorn, son of Arathorn, the rightful heir of Gondor, Arnor, and Anarion. We can also be anti-monarchist in real life, but like the tropes give you the story. It is a story of family conflict where the family is running a kingdom. It's just so much juicier. You just kind of want to keep an eye on some things.
And the main thing I want to get at is like, I'm willing to work with a story on its level. Like I said, Lord of the Rings, I'm not thinking about the divine right of kings that much.
Yeah.
But if there was a big thing in Lord of the Rings where it's like, Aragorn inherits this one kingdom, and the story is like, and then this works so much better than the neighboring democratic kingdom or the neighboring libertarian kingdom, and it's like the story is engaging with the idea of politics, well, then I'm gonna start engaging with it.
Yeah.
Same thing with like Baldur's Gate 3. The first act I'm gonna talk about here, so I'm not really gonna be going into spoilers, but like first act, it's like the game is like, yeah, here's this group of druids who are discriminatory against the tieflings, and the tieflings are discriminatory against the Githyanki. And it's like, okay, we are setting up a storyline of these different like racial groups having beef with each other. And then it's like, these are the goblins. They write and talk and have culture, but it's okay to mow them down because it's goblins. It's like, hey, wait a minute.
Yeah, that's kind of where you got to think about like, well, wait a minute, is it okay? And I think there's interesting storylines to be explored in like, okay, for example, if goblins are essentially humanoid and they're sentient and they have a culture and we do mow them down all the time, why is that? Like, is there some sort of cultural difference in there? Could that be a fun story to explore? That it's a misunderstanding of some kind between goblin culture and human culture that always brings them into conflict. So, so like these are ways that these can open up pathways for you, basically, of different storytelling ideas when you can look at this. And I mean, again, we talked about in the first episode how Curse of Strahd was born because the original writer for the Castle Ravenloft module was playing a dungeon crawler in like advanced D&D or something like that, and a vampire was in a room. And it didn't make sense to the player that the vampire was in the room because it didn't vibe with the rest of the dungeon. He's like, well, why is a vampire there? And that got him to think about vampires in D&D, and it led to Curse of Strahd. You can consider, well, why are goblins the villains all of the time? Or are the goblins that we're dealing with, they're just thieves, and maybe we have cool goblins. You can have characters meet a cool goblin clan that's like totally normal village, just like any other regular standard human village. It's all little nuggets that you can explore.
Basically, this was a long way of us saying that no matter what genre that you're working with, when you're creating a story within that genre, think about it as you're creating it. So real quick, some game recommendations for the fantasy genre in the tabletop RPG space. Of course, there's Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
Mm-hmm.
Kayla and I both play it. We have our criticisms of it. There is a cliche of that being everyone's one and only tabletop RPG, but it's still very fun to play. But there's also Morkborg if you want to play a dark fantasy tabletop RPG.
Morkborg is fun. You will immediately die. It is. Well, I did anyway.
Our first session of Morkborg, first round, first attack, Kayla's character dropped dead. It was very fun.
I died 20 minutes in and spent the rest of the time heckling the players. And that was fine because Kevin made it very clear up front. You guys probably will not actually beat this game. I think they did end up completing the mission.
Yeah.
But the point of Morkborg is that it's really hard and everybody's gonna die, and we understood that and wanted to do that night. That's the other, that's the thing, is like everybody wants to play a really hard, crunchy game where everybody's going to die at the end. So much fun. Let's do Morkborg.
Mm-hmm.
If that's not what people want to do, they're not going to have as much fun. I was totally chill dying 15 minutes in and watching the rest of it unfold because Kevin was upfront that might happen. And I said, okay, bet. And then it did. And it was cool. I went out awesome.
To be fair, you were also able to quickly create another character. Morkborg does have very quick character creation rules.
I did come back as another character later on in the night.
But yeah, if you want to play a more typical fantasy game, but you want to do a different rule set than 5th edition, maybe something that's a little easier to learn, there's also Dungeon World, which is more standard fantasy trappings, but the rule set is powered by the apocalypse, so it's more narrative focused, and it's a little bit easier to pick up than the more crunchier D&D 5e rule set. And finally, if you're wanting to get into like urban fantasy, especially a sort of like noir, mystery, like secret magical underworld kind of game, I have to recommend City of Mist. Disclaimer, I am not sponsored by Son of Oak Game Studio. I do have a working relationship with them. I have created multiple videos for City of Mist and have written for Son of Oak Game Studio, but this specific podcast episode is not sponsored by Son of Oak Game Studio. I just still like their games.
Yeah, City of Mist is fun. It was the first game that I ever played with Kevin. It was, because I went with my friend and roommate, who maybe at some point you guys will meet in DKS. We might have her on at some point for something. We went to a meetup for RPG fans to go and play video games at a brewery in downtown Los Angeles. And we went because the two of us, my friend and I, we wanted to play more D&D. We were in a group together that didn't get to meet very often. We're like, we want to go play D&D. And we got there, and the 2 D&D tables were already full. And we're like, yeah, I don't know. Like, we came to play D&D. And the guy that organized the event was like, well, I don't know. I think you guys should just come play with Kevin. He's playing City of Mist. And I was like, I've never heard of that. He's like, just come play, it'll be fun. So we're like, okay, like we came all the way here to play a game. Like, let's just have fun. Sat down, had a blast. We've been friends with Kevin ever since. And City of Mist was it was fun. It was easy to pick up. I had a ton of fun playing that, exploring it. It's a cool setting, so as somebody who doesn't necessarily have a working relationship, there's also my endorsement on City of Mist. It's fun.
That story warms my heart, but I also do like how you frame it as like, oh, I was the second choice.
Well, it's not. I didn't know you were a choice. If that makes you feel better. That's a note for anybody playing RPGs, is that you should be open-minded. I don't think you should be super set in exactly what you want to do, because if we had insisted, no, we don't want to try another system, we only want to play D&D, never would have met Kevin. And never would have started our regular D&D campaign or tried any of these other RPGs that he's introduced me to. So that's the big thing, is focus. If you want to play an RPG, just play whatever RPG you have available to you.
Big thesis of this episode. 1, think about what you're writing in the genre that you're writing in, but also be willing to try other things. And on that note, let's kind of like go through the rest of the genres with games that we know about, just kind of like clip through it real quick. Because we spent quite a bit talking about the fantasy genre and like problematic trends in certain genres. But I would be remiss if we didn't talk about games that existed outside the fantasy genre. Like, for example, the sci-fi genre, which, you can get into the weeds on like, is sci-fi fantasy where the magic is science? But when you talk about fantasy versus sci-fi, there are still clear ideas in people's heads of like the differences between them and like the space that you're operating in. But even then, with those clear ideas, there's a lot of different kinds of sci-fi. You have your standard space opera, and on that note, I would recommend the Star Trek Adventures tabletop RPG, especially if you are a fan of Star Trek. But also, I like how they structure their game. They structure their game to promote like teamwork and exploration and making combat a bit more deadly than just like, all right, we're Space Marines, let's go and mow down like 100 aliens.
A bit more grounded.
Exactly. There's also there is more grounded sci-fi as well. Like if you go into the cyberpunk genre, for instance, like that's going to be more of a like, you're in a city and technology has advanced, but advanced to the point of like, you have a robot arm or you have computer screen eyes. And usually with Cyberpunk, there are story trappings of like, usually the conflict is against corporations or the degradation of society or your lack of autonomy in the face of a world where technology and corporate power is ever expanding.
I don't think that's relatable at all. I'm not sure I could relate to that or see myself in that genre at all. It doesn't seem, it seems
Right?
so fantastical.
I like Cyberpunk because it is the world we are living in, but you can shoot Jeff Bezos with your robot arm.
Yeah, it's a little bit of wish fulfillment there. You can fight back a bit on the corporations and the man.
Yeah, but there's also some like darker tones to it. Like there's also kind of a thing, an expectation with Cyberpunk that you're probably not going to get a happy ending.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of like getting into Breaking Bad. This isn't going to end well for the meth drug dealer.
It's very cathartic to play a tragedy RPG, I have to say. I'm a tragedy enjoyer.
Oh, yeah. So, if you want to play a good Cyberpunk game, there is, of course, the classic Cyberpunk Red. I am also a fan of Cyborg, which is the Cyberpunk spinoff to Morkborg.
Great fun. I've played that one with Kevin. Great fun.
And then, on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who want to get into, like, mecha RPGs, especially people who have watched, like, high-octane anime like Gundam or Code Geass, where it's, like, beautiful people and giant robots fighting each other.
I absolutely want to do. Can we play, like, a Pacific Rim RPG?
So I have a Pacific Rim RPG. It was a spin-off. Yeah, it's a Pacific Rim adventures spin-off with like rules for piloting giant robots for the game Everyday Heroes, which is a D&D 5e compatible game but is styled after action movies. I have not played through the adventure itself. And also, disclaimer, I have done a video advertising this adventure. I am not being sponsored by Evil Genius Games, etc., etc., etc. There is also, I believe, like one of the more popular mecha tabletop RPGs out there is Lancer. And, Lancer is like far future, galaxy spanning, like all of these different colonized planets, and the giant robots you can pilot range from like the typical giant robots to like this one is powered by an eldritch horror AI kind of thing.
Ooh, heck yeah.
Yeah, I will say there's a lot of cool ideas with Lancer, but going back to our discussion on like what politics do you engage with, Lancer does unironically call its world a utopia multiple times.
Interesting.
Yeah, and when you enter into the world building with that in mind, it does kind of invite you to be like, okay, you call this a utopia, but also there's like corporate slave planets. Like we should probably interact with that.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds, speaking of relatable plot lines, growing up thinking that you live in a super fantastical society that's the best ever, and then slowly realizing, oh, this is the Fire Nation.
Can't relate.
It's kind of it could be fun to explore that in gaming. I enjoy when there are problematic tropes to engage with in a way that is critical of it. That's what I love doing that in RPGs. I mean, some people, they want to turn their brain off and have fun and unwind, and that's totally kosher. That's absolutely valid. If you just want to have fun and you're not really here to engage in grad level thesis on sociology and whatnot and politics, that's okay. We're not telling you need to, again, we're not saying you need to be hypercritical in every aspect of your life, but it also, like, you live in a society.
Yeah.
So there is some homework that should be done at some point in time. And very rarely are people, I think, actually playing Monopoly and then walking out of it being like, I'm going to become a robber baron. We all know. I would hope that we all know. But yeah, that's just something that, you want to think about. And you want to make the active decision that this is something that you're engaging with, instead of engaging with it passively and accidentally causing some sort of conflict at the table because you've hit on a sore spot.
Oh, yeah. Once again, just be mindful of the politics that you're engaging with. And, for those who are like, oh, I just play games without politics, newsflash, not a thing.
Yeah,
If
art
you,
is
if yeah,
political. All art is
yeah.
inherently political, games included.
And it's not like, oh, this thing has a problematic trope, so I shouldn't play it. No, if you're playing a
No.
sci-fi game and there's corporate slave planets, sure, yeah, that gives us conflict, that gives us something to interact with.
Yeah.
If you make a sci-fi universe that has corporate slave planets and you also say within the text that this is a utopia, well, I kind of have to engage in a discussion with what are the creators' politics.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Just, just thoughts. Just light, super light thoughts that we're having.
exactly. Well, we talk about genre and we're talking about these like broad cultural spaces that have all of their history attached to it that they're dragging forward. Big thing though that we're trying to get at is that like what genre you're playing in, people have different views of what they want out of that genre because there's also a lot of different subsects of those genre. So speaking of other genres, real quick, let's touch on the horror genre because I love horror games in the tabletop RPG space. We've brought it up multiple times. The Curse of Strahd module for D&D 5e is actually my favorite Dungeons & Dragons module. I think it's the most well put together. I like the ideas that are being put in. I like Strahd as a character. Whenever I run Curse of Strahd, I have to do a complete rewrite on the Vistani people because they are pretty much Romani stereotypes that were present in the original Dracula.
Yeah, if you've read Dracula and you were like, oh boy, at the depictions of the Romani people in it, it's pretty much the same in Curse of Strahd. Wizards of the Coast. They even, when, I believe, I haven't read the Curse of Strahd module because of spoilers, but Kevin, correct me if I'm wrong, even the revamped version still has some problematic holdover material.
Yeah.
And there's horror just in general. Horror is fascinating because its problematic elements are all over the place and its subversion of some of that is all over the place. It is an incredibly political genre. I would argue in many ways horror can be the most political genre. In terms of trying to remove politics from art, which you can't do, it is hardest to remove politics from horror or to try and unentwine it because I think it is kind of the most political genre. It's my favorite genre of all time. I love horror. It's so good, guys. If you're a scaredy cat, I'm so sorry for you. Get well. I was a scaredy cat. I'm still a scaredy cat. But I think that the storytelling that happens in horror is just some of our best stories are horror stories. But it does have a lot of problematic elements. And that's kind of the fun thing, too, with horror is also engaging in those problematic elements. And talking about it critically, I mean, Jordan Peele is all over the place with engaging in that. Scream engaged in that. Women in horror is an entire... You could teach college courses on the depiction of women in horror from...
I took that exact class, by the way.
Oh, did you? Oh, yeah, I'm so jealous.
I went to college at Indiana University Bloomington. I got a major in the legal word of the degree was telecommunications, but it was basically Indiana University's version of like a film degree. And I took a class examining problematic elements, but especially like women's role in horror. We watched like Cat People and a bunch of different stuff. Yeah, no, I did actually take that class.
Well, and horror is just so much engaging with what scares us as a society. And a lot of that can be really mired in bigotry. So when you're playing a horror game, it's just something to kind of keep an eye on to make sure that, you're not throwing something in there that you don't want in there, and you can make edits. That's the thing. It's just take it out or edit it or whatever. I had no idea that Curse of Strahd had these problematic depictions of Vistani people until Kevin mentioned at the end of one session. By the way, yeah, I edited all of that.
Well, here's the thing. A big part of Dungeons & Dragons is they still have the alignment system. They've been moving away from it, but they still will like label like enemies and people with like lawful good or chaotic neutral or something like that. And The Curse of Strahd text is very explicit in labeling every Vistani character, except for like one or two, with the alignment lawful evil. Like on multiple occasions, the Curse of Strahd text is like, all of the Vistani that you interact with are fundamentally evil, so says the text of this game. And it's like, that's bad.
Yeah, there's
especially for a people who are essentially a parody of Romani stereotypes. So the horror genre has a lot of different subsects of the genre as well, and that's kind of the fun thing about the genre, is that it can fit in so many different ways, but also each of the different ways has their own hangups. Like you have like slasher horror, like Friday the 13th, and you can get a, like a Monster of the Week game going with that. But also, like watching Friday the 13th, you look at those old movies and it's like they had weird ideas about how much sexual promiscuity needed to be punished.
Yeah.
You have alien horror. Like there's a lot of cool, like literally titled Alien, like the movie.
Yeah, there's
RPGs.
Alien. There is licensed Alien RPG, by the way. Like you could, not sponsored, you could play that. There's also, I'm very excited I'm getting my not sponsored, but I did support Mothership on Kickstarter. I'm very excited to get my deluxe backer kit and really crack into that.
Mm-hmm.
It's a sci-fi horror module, and they have all sorts of different, whether it's exploring haunted planets, basically. Moon's haunted. Let's go. There's also Call of Cthulhu. Speaking of problematic horror,
speaking of
Call
problematic
of Cthulhu
horror
from Lovecraft himself.
If you need to know anything about Lovecraft, it's that he
Google
heard about yeah, exact. Google the name of the cat. But also he heard about the concept of air conditioning and then decided to make a horror book about it. And it's because he did not immediately understand it, and that must mean that it was horrifying. That's the kind of man H.P. Lovecraft was. Also incredibly racist.
Yes.
But yeah, there's slasher horror, alien horror, zombie horror, cosmic horror, all kinds of horror.
Vampire the Masquerade,
Call of Cthulhu, Vaesen, Mothership, the Curse of Strahd D&D module, Monster of the Week. There's so many good horror games, you guys. Check them out.
Even if you're a scaredy cat.
Even if you're a scaredy cat.
Can't... Horror fascinates you, but you can't sit through a horror movie. Maybe engaging in a horror RPG could be a way for you to engage in that genre a little bit more.
Another genre that I don't personally interact with that much, but I do love reading the games, and I do love that they're there, is romance. There's actually quite a few romance tabletop RPGs where the point is less we have to kill the dragon to, save the world, and more navigating the social politics of whatever scene you're in. And, you have your fantastical like monster romance, or you have your old style like Pride and Prejudice Regency romance, and there are games that mix the two. You have like high school romance. If you just want to play a Riverdale RPG, there are a few of those. In fact, the ones that I especially enjoy reading are Monster Hearts, specifically Monster Hearts 2. I think the sequel is basically just an upgrade to the previous game, and that's like you're at a high school and all of you are secretly like vampires or werewolves or whatever. And I like how they blend.
It's Teen Wolf, baby.
There's Thirsty Sword Lesbians, which is
is that the actual name of it?
That's the actual name of it. Thirsty Sword
Lesbians. That's
Lesbians.
hilarious.
It is a game that is centered on it's basically the Shira Katra dynamic.
Oh,
just like,
okay.
Yeah, you duel each other, but also you look deeply in each other's eyes, like kind of thing.
I enjoy enemies to lovers.
Yeah, it's enemies to lovers, the game. And then there is a shorter game that I have not played, but I have, and I very much love the concept of Visigoths versus Mallgoths. You play in a mall, and you play as either a modern day Mallgoth, or you play as a Visigoth, like a marauder who has been transported to the modern day.
Downfall of the Roman Empire. We should play that.
I'd love to.
Yeah. I also have not played romance RPGs. I do enjoy a good rom-com, though. Some people never do romance in their RPGs. Some people do romance in their RPGs. For the first time with our Curse of Strahd module, I have RP'd romance. I was scared to do it before. It's not that bad, guys. So if you're interested, just have at it. It can be very fun.
And genres blend all the time. Like what you were just saying, like we're playing Curse of Strahd, and that's a horror campaign.
Yeah.
But also we've been sprinkling in romantic elements to it.
It's the drama that it produces is just too juicy to ignore.
Exactly.
I was called by the drama.
But yeah, but there's noir fantasy, there's horror sci-fi, there's monster romance. We as humans love taking a bunch of different genres and then smushing them together and then seeing what comes out. So once again, we're probably going to say this like every episode at this point. Don't be afraid to read and watch a bunch of stuff and then get weird with it.
Yeah, and you can probably, if there's a game that you're thinking of, like, oh, I want to play a campaign where blah blah blah, just put that into Google with RPG, and there might be something that's already there for you to get your grubby little hands all over and have some fun with.
And I mean, there's also quite a bit of like the one pager RPGs that are specifically for those like weird genre spaces. Like a little bit more about that than I do.
Yeah, if you are wanting to play RPGs with your friends and you're a busy adult with a real job and many obligations, one pager RPGs could be an excellent thing for you, because literally all of the rules of the game will fit on one page. They're easy to pick up. They're easy to learn. A lot of them are by, I was looking through all of the ones I've heard of, and I realized that game designer Grant Howitt had done almost all of the ones that I knew of. Some examples are Crash Pandas, which is like a street racing game. So if you wanted to play a Fast and the Furious game where you are raccoons, check out Crash Pandas. The Beast, it's a monster hunting mystery game set in 18th century Europe. So if you're thinking Curse of Strahd sounds really interesting, but I don't have time to really like learn D&D or to play a long form module, check that out. Kaiju Girls is a high school drama meets giant monster fights where you are a teenage girl going through high school, but also you turn into a giant kaiju, which we love here at Digital Kaiju Studios. So again, an alternative to Monster Hearts if you don't have time. There's a one pager right there for you. Sad Vampire Boyfriend doesn't even need a GM. So if you have a group of friends who nobody wants to volunteer to GM, there you go. Try that one out. You can just go in, look up one page RPGs. There's also shorter ones. I think it's One Last Job is like a time loop heist RPG as a pretty short rule book. I'm really interested in. I have not had the opportunity to play it yet. I think it looks really cool. So not every RPG out there has a big chunky book that you need to read through. Some of them can be very short, something that you can break out that night at game night. Everybody read through it and then get at it very quickly. There are lots of options in the RPG world. And speaking of options, there's also solo RPGs, which some might argue are basically just a guided creative writing program. But that's fine too. There's a little bit of a saying in the RPG community with the play styles of certain players. It's like, just go write a book, So this might be an option for you. A solo RPG where you basically go through these like guided prompts, and it's basically a journaling game. So if you want to play a little bit more, or you don't really have a group yet, or your group can't meet that often, then a solo RPG might be a fun idea for you. There's lots of them. Lots of them tend to be a little horror leaning, just in the nature of it's an isolated game. Not all of them though, but some examples are Lighthouse at the End of the World, 1,000-Year-Old Vampire and its variant, Magical Year of a Teenage Witch. There's Ex Novo, Alone Among the Stars, Village Witch, which has a 2-player option. So if you and a buddy are really interested in RPGs and you don't really have a great group to play with, that could be one where you guys could play together. And then also The Machine. Again, get out there, get on Google, look into solo RPGs, go to your local game store. They're bound to have several on display. Read through them, see what's interesting to you. There are all sorts of options out there.
And this is a note to the audience, but also a note to myself while editing. We are going to have the links to all the different games that we've mentioned during this episode in the show notes. If you genuinely want to check out any of the games that we've been talking about, go to the description and check them out there.
Yeah, and we were not sponsored by any of the game designers These are just games that either we have enjoyed, games that we are interested in, games that we found in research for this episode. So we're not trying to sell you on any of these. We just all think that they're genuinely interesting, cool games that sound like fun to play.
But here is something that we're going to try to sell you on, folks, and
Hey.
that is commenting. So, audience, tell us in the comments, what genres of games do you like playing best, especially with like tabletop RPGs?
Mm-hmm.
What are your favorite systems to play? Were there any genres or games that we didn't mention that we should check out? Because Kayla and I love checking out like new TTRPGs and trying
Yes.
new experiences.
Send me
That's
your
what we'd love to do.
recommendations. I want to know what else is out there. And then I want to make Kevin flip the table when we play.
Get in the comments and get on our Discord server and talk to us there. How do you get to our Discord server? Well, thank you for asking, hypothetical audience member. We have a Ko-fi page where if you pledge and help us out with some pocket change, like literally less than the price of a granola bar, you can support us. You can gain access to our Discord server, and we also have a bunch of cool bonus content like extra episodes. So definitely check it out. Once again, that link will be in the description as well.
Mm-hmm. And links to our social media. If you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe, give us a rating, leave a comment, and share with a friend. Once again, the most effective form of marketing is word of mouth. If you want to support your friendly, local, independent creators, definitely tell a friend to support your friendly, local, independent creators. And wrapping this up, Writing for Roleplay is a production of Digital Kaiju Studios. It is hosted and produced by Kevin Carpenter and Kayla Knutson. It is edited mostly by Kevin because Kayla volunteered to do other stuff. Guess who runs the Tumblr?
We post a new episode every Tuesday, so until then, see you next week.
Bye.